Professor Jennings, over to you and welcome.
Thank you, Bishop Pete. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a joy for me to be here with you, even digitally. I echo Bishop Pete's words and hopes that at some point in time in the future, the near future, that I can have the opportunity to be with you in person and share a meal or two and enjoy time together. I also want to thank Brother Goodman for his wonderful work of setting things up, being in conversation with me about these lectures, and giving to me the bad news that we couldn't be together. He did it so kindly and graciously that I was able to wipe away a few of the tears a little more quickly. But I am looking forward to the day when we are together. My friends, I am speaking to you from my home in Hamden, Connecticut, which is very close to New Haven, Connecticut, where Yale University is. I live near a place called Sleeping Giant Mountain on the lands of the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples. And I have promised that as long as I live on these unceded lands of these peoples, that I will do my best to honor the way they have and continue to shepherd these lands in hopes that my life will witness not only respect for the land, but respect for them. I also want to bring you warmest greetings from my dean, Gregory Sterling, my faculty colleagues and staff, and the students of Yale Divinity School, where every day we strive to do the best we can to discern what the Spirit of God is asking us to do in this wonderful work of education. And it is about education that I want to talk to you about today, as the bishop mentioned the title of my talk. It is about education and belonging and the relationship between those two marvelous words. My friends, it all begins in desire. All education, whether of church or the academy, begins in desire. The desire that brought me and so many I know into this educational endeavor was the desire to escape limiting ways of living and thinking and being and even desiring. I have learned that escaping is a motivation that connects many of us who inhabit the academic world and seek an education. But I have learned in my many years of being in academic spaces that the desire we bring to our education, has to be exchanged at the door for another set of desires. Entrance and existence in the academy and even often in the church requires we sublimate our desires for another set of desires. The desires we are given in the Western Academy aim to form us into another. The Western Academy aims to form us into the image of a white, self-sufficient man who embodies three dismal virtues: possession, control, and mastery. It doesn't matter whether you are male or female, trans, non-binary, your ethnicity, your nationality, your political position does not matter. Your progressivism or conservatism, your radicality, your faith, your non-faith are all inconsequential in these matters. All that matters is that you understand that the price of the ticket into the academy is your willingness to be formed into this man and take up his desires. My book, After Whiteness, gives witness to what so many of us already deeply sense, but have not given ourselves the space or the time or the freedom to speak what we know. We are in someone else's desires. It was the master's desire, the modern colonialist master's desires that gave birth to this tragic white self-sufficient masculinist image. Self-sufficiency has to do with the legacy of the magnanimous man, the man who, inspired by the logic of Stoicism, lived a balanced life, never giving to the extremes of gluttony, lust, anger, or emotion. He is one who never apologizes for his strength and his decisiveness, but always uses his power for the good. He is one who makes no excuses for weakness. It is this sense of self-sufficiency that shows up throughout the colonial world, in the encomiendas, the haciendas, and especially the plantations of the New World. The colonial master's desires pulled forward ancient strands of ambition that he wove around the minds and bodies of his children. He desired his sons and daughters would become white, self-sufficient men, able to show in body and mind, in action and reaction, control, possession, mastery. They must be able to show their finish. They must be able to show control of their passions and urges, their anger and enthusiasm. They must be in possession of strong minds and bodies and able to maintain possession of what they have been given and what they will inherit. And they must be prepared to face the unknown with a commitment to its mastery, to go from one obstacle to the next, and to go from mastery to mastery. All of Western education is formed between the dream of the colonial masters and the aspirations of his sons and daughters. So here is the question: what does it mean to be educated between the desires of the masters and the desires of his children? These are the questions we are obligated to answer, because it was Western education, and theological education more specifically, that positioned all of us inside these desires and placed us all on this path to fulfill the master's dream. So this legacy of dreaming men who attain power and can handle power becomes so compelling and intoxicating for educational institutions and educators, for churches and church leadership, like drug addicts whose ways of being in the world have been contorted by the desire for the drug. Our ways of being in educational and ecclesial institutions have been contorted by the desire to exhibit the control, possession, and mastery of this man. A poem for us to consider entitled Windows, Windows. Please, please, fear poor men who are smart. Be terrified of bright women who were raised in lack. These people are dangerous inside thinking walls, where they feel the power of thought that can make them pastless and thoughtfully thoughtless. Free now to rationalize their hungers, they are fit for making walls, destroying doors for all who might take their gain and return them poor. Their only hope now, those windows not quite fit for the frame, with seeping sunlight and invading cold air, keeping the room feeling outside so everyone can see their breathing. How do you change desires? Desires of becoming the self-sufficient man and showing your finish. Desires so powerful and compelling that they pull you in so deeply that you end up only tearing down the impediments to those desires. They must be countered. They must be countered with another desire, another desire that could seep in or slip in and corrupt the master's desires if you will crumble it from within. I suggested after whiteness an alternative desire, the desire for belonging, the desire for belonging that aims us toward a different image, the image of Jesus and the crowd, the image of Jesus and the crowd. And it is this I want us to spend the lion's share of our time thinking about today. Jesus gathers a crowd, that motley, unruly mass of people who are together only because of Jesus. The crowd is not Christian, and thusly this image should not be seen as exclusively Christian. It is, however, the basis on which a Christian should form. And it is the basis on which life together, rich life together, should form. This is an alternative, overarching image of who and how one should be as an educated person, skilled to do any task. This alternative image of formation is cultivating the ability and disposition to gather people together, people who would never imagine themselves being together, but here they are together. Here they are together because of you. Whether you are aiming to be a minister or a professor, doctor or a nurse, an architect or a pharmacist, what you announce by the way you do your work is not a white, self-sufficient, masculinist presence that always tries to show, always tries to exhibit possession, control, and mastery, but someone who facilitates belonging. People coming to know one another as they come to know you. People who would never, ever be together, never want to talk to one another, never imagine life entangled together, except for you. Jesus and the crowd is an image that does not present an imperial position from which to think, listen, and learn, but a reality of chaos, where the lack of control, possession, and mastery meets Jesus and his disciples. My friends, the crowd cannot be made self-sufficient. The crowd cannot be made self-sufficient. The screaming crowds comprised of people crying out in pain and suffering, desperate for help, shoulder to shoulder with their enemies, ready to kill them at the slightest offense and the first opportunity. And there, in the midst, an uneasy silence emerges as those same people strain to hear the sound of God in the voice of Jesus. Indeed, the crowd exposes the truth that Jesus and his disciples are joined with them in need for God's help. And in so doing, it is the crowd that forces the exegesis of God in Jesus. Another poem for us entitled Before. Before the confession, here was crying out. Before the teaching, here was feeling terror. Before the word spoken, here was longing for. You have heard it said, here now, breathing, reaching, waiting, people sensing the many, salvation beginning. What would it mean to have an educational endeavor centered in belonging, my friends? What would it mean to have a professional and personal identity centered in belonging? This is belonging not understood as sentiment or affect or romantic longing, but as the centering intellectual reality of for our work and the centering reality of our identities. The Western Academy, as it now exists, has banished belonging, found it to be an impediment to a clear-eyed focus on the individual and the instilling of the performative logics that guide our evaluative ecologies. We have been shaped to think the one destined to order and control the many. And so the question becomes, in this dismal schema, what is required for that one to rule, to lead? Ironically, there is a vision of belonging in this dismal schema. It is one centered in whiteness, where the peoples of the world are gathered around white bodies in service and in submission, formed to enhance spiritually, intellectually, and materially white thriving. The belonging I envision requires we rethink the work and reality of the academy and the church away from whiteness, 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 that process and reality of identity reconstruction that at this moment is becoming a painful revelation for so many in this world. It must be said again and again, whiteness, my friends, is not phenotype, not first appearance, not biology or culture, and it's certainly not a part of God's creation. Whiteness is a way of seeing the world and a way of being in the world at the same time. Whiteness is a way of organizing the world, making sense of the world. And whiteness is having the power to order one's world by that effort. Whiteness is an engine of aspiration. And so many people, my friends, who identify as white have never, ever faced the work necessary to undo that aspiration, especially if they inhabit academic and or ecclesial spaces where that aspiration lives, moves, and has its happy being. To become grounded in belonging requires we reimagine who we are and what we are doing in the work of ministry and of teaching and of scholarship and of service. The first step is to see ourselves as fragment workers. Those are the words. Fragment workers. Fragment workers. And here we must return to Jesus and that needy crowd, my friends, that needy crowd. Consider the scene from Matthew chapter 14, beginning with verse 13, where Jesus feeds the 5,000. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so they may go into the villages and buy some food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And he said, "Bring them here to me." And then you know the rest. Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. He looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowd. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, the broken fragments, 12 baskets full. The gathering of the fragments, my friends, is where we begin our work. The gathering of the fragments is where we begin our work. Always after the miracle, always after the showing of divine compassion, always after the command to keep them together and feed them. All education and all ministry is in fragments. We never know everything we should or could know, especially when we teach what we know. We never know everything we could or should know about someone as we offer ministry and service. We do not have every word of Jesus. We do not have his every action, the stratagems he deployed in his ministry. We do not have all the words of his disciples, complete pictures of their lives. Indeed, no saint, great or small, no thinker, writer, artist has left us all the maps, the complete maps to their lives. We play in scripture, pericopes, sayings, copies of copies, none of it comprehensive. We teach fragments. We do ministry in fragments, pieces and parts, slices and shards. And this, my friends, is good. This is holy. This is what God intends. The pieces and the working with the pieces. It is strength and beauty. It is strength and beauty, not weakness or failure. The point is not a plea. That is, my point is not a plea for humility because we do not know everything, though humility is important. The point here is that this is the beginning. This is the beginning of the weaving. That's the key word for today, the weaving. It is the entrance into the place where the Spirit of the living God draws us into the creative energies of God, where the weaving will build knowledge and new knowledge. God would guide us into the weaving. What must be held up, sewn together. What can be set aside for now, and what must be broken or torn into smaller pieces and fit together. And all of it to speak of the divine life and the life of the creature, and that life that must become life together. We, however, have been trained not to see ourselves as fragment workers, but people who must show our finish in relation to our disciplinary knowledges. We must show possession, show control, and show mastery. And for most of us, it was our rituals of instruction that made this so. I think of my own history of instruction. And allow me to offer yet another poem that reflects some of that history that is not just mine, but so many others. This poem is entitled Doctoral Seminar. Doctoral seminar, time for hearing, Your Honor. Nervous energy quivering until the room levitates downward with doctoral students lost in running a tight circle, underground, faster and faster. I will ask a question. Will I sound intelligent? Like I belong to the room filled with bitten apples, all staring at me with bright light? I sweat, waiting for my slender opening to give the sound of thought and prove something to no one in particular. Until the day comes when I stop listening to fears and listen to voices, including my own. Some never hear the sound of intelligence. So we miss the call to the weaving, my friends, weaving pieces together with others. Now, am I referring to something called interdisciplinary work? Interdisciplinarity, yes, but so much more, so much more. We are called to see who we are together as we handle knowledge. We are called to see who we are together as we handle knowledge, leaving things and adding things and suturing things and molding things together, all attuned to what the Spirit is guiding us toward. And what is that, Dr. Jennings? I'm so glad you asked me that. Communion. Communion. Communion, that theologically dense idea, that ecclesially rich word. What do I mean by communion? By communion, I mean the deepest sense of God-drenched life, attuned to life together, not with people in general, but with the people that comprise the place of one's concrete living, and the places, the landscapes, the animals, the plants, the land, the waterways, and the built environments that constitute the actual condition of one's life. Yet communion also means new realities of dwelling, where we are being drawn by the Spirit to new configurations of life with others we would not imagine or desire to be with, to live with. Communion is being led by the Spirit of God into the lives of others and allow the lives of others to join our lives. And these others, my friends, are rarely our first choice. The weaving aims for communion, which brings me back to the first fragment, the fragment of faith. That is, the fragment of established knowledge, the fragment of scholarly conversation. Yet the call to the weaving turns us to a second fragment. The second fragment work draws our attention to the shattering effects of modern colonialism, where so many peoples had their worlds torn apart and torn into pieces. So many people long for those who would work with their fragments. So many students want an education that helps them gather the fragments of their people's cultures, practices, their wisdom and knowledge, and ways of being, thinking, their histories and stories, and to weave those fragments with the fragments of all that they are being exposed to and presented in their education. Tragically, this request often falls on deaf ears as faculty and administrators absolve themselves of any responsibility to help students of formerly colonized peoples and students of color do this vital work. But that is not all. So many people in church communities also want church leaders that help them gather their fragments and weave those fragments with the fragments that constitute the liturgical, ecclesial, and social life of the church. This, my friends, is the plea. This is the plea behind the hope for more diverse and inclusive curricula and courses in both the church and the academy. This is the plea behind more cultural sensitivity training and education in both the church and the academy. To be able to hear it requires more than politely acknowledging the importance of diversity. It requires the desire to weave the fragments, to take hold of that history of colonial fragmentation and join in the desire to honor, remember, and restore. Honor, remember, and restore what was lost or forgotten, and then bind it to what should be taught, discovered, learned, and explored. Think of the many people, my friends, think of the many people who all their lives have been told indirectly or directly that the wisdom and knowledge of their elders, the cultural practices of their people, the visions of life of those that gave them life are only tangential to what they are learning in the church or the academy. Think of their quiet hope, their secret plea that they might encounter ministers and church leaders, administrators, professors who know of the fragmentation that their peoples have experienced and who are now committed to helping them in the weaving. To do this urgent work requires those who don't imagine that they need control, possession, and mastery of those fragments to be helpful, but only the desire to weave. It would also require people who not only do not fear the cultural other, but who do not fear being seen as a learner and who desire to be seen as lovers of new fragments because they love people. But all of this must be done with a view toward the third kind of fragment work that we must do, and that is to resist the commodity fragment. We are all caught inside the buying and selling of everything, especially education. And the danger for us is that we continue to treat life, the life of peoples, and the life of other creatures as things to be known and owned. This also brings us back to the horrors of our colonial legacies, in which to know a thing was to own a thing, and where so much of indigenous life was stolen, packaged, and sold. We who inhabit church and academy live in the danger of becoming intellectual merchants, untouched by the fragments we touch. We resist that merchant behavior with its relentless drive to commodify everything by understanding the gift and the responsibility of touching fragments. The first fragment, the fragment of faith. The second fragment, the fragments that come from the fragmentation through the colonial wound. The third fragment, the commodity fragment that we must resist. Yet the first step of claiming we are fragment workers and moving toward an education of belonging is to touch desire again. Not only the desire that brought us into ministry or into the academy, but also the desire of a God who reveals desire, seeking, always seeking to draw us into a desire for others, and with it, a weaving of life together with them in and through the Spirit. So my friends, I close with one final poetic offering entitled Quilters. Quilters. They sat in the ancient place, remembering the shattered, pockets and bags filled with remnants captured by keen sight, able to touch what be not as though it were possible to make. These multi-shaded women knew their anointing, the power to join broken glass, torn hearts, pebbles large and small, blood-stained bricks, pieces of those aprons that smelled like fresh bread, flashes of sadness caught in song, the extra fabric from the wedding dress, little napkins, quick melancholies, bunches of laughter, shreds from curtains for soul windows. Then with eyes aligned, stepping out onto nothingness, handling things that could slice flesh and pierce skin. They placed pieces side by side, unprecedented, but now obvious beauty. Then they decided in majestic wisdom to create soft shelter against the cold, against threat, against forgetting caress. And as the final threads joined, they felt the well done. Thank you very much.